My name is Nora Calloway, and I was 31 years old when my parents mailed a letter to my husband asking him to leave me. Not a phone call. Not a conversation over dinner. A letter. Typed, printed, signed by both of them, sealed in one of those heavy cream envelopes my mother keeps in the writing desk she inherited from her mother. The kind of envelope that is meant to signal permanence. The letter said a lot of things. But the line Andrew read to me that evening, standing at the kitchen counter with the paper flat in his hand, was this: "You are not what this family built, and we are asking you, respectfully, to consider whether you are doing Nora any favors by staying." He read it once. He folded it along the original crease. He put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, the gray one he wears to every meeting he considers worth remembering, and he said, quietly, "I'm going to keep this."
I didn't know why at the time.
15 months later, in a ballroom in Seattle, in front of 300 people, I understood exactly why. Welcome back to channel, where quiet people let the record speak for them. If you're new here, hit subscribe. We post every week. And if you've ever had someone underestimate the person standing next to you, drop a comment. I want to hear it. I grew up understanding from a very early age that my family measured people the way other families measure lumber, by dimension, by grade, by whether the cut was clean. My father, Richard Calloway, had built a commercial real estate development firm over 30 years. Not a dynasty, exactly, but something adjacent to one. He had a name in Portland. He sat on boards. He was the kind of man who was introduced at charity events with a number attached, the square footage of his portfolio, the year the company was founded, the approximate valuation, which he never corrected downward even when the market suggested he should. My mother, Diane, was the interpreter of his ambitions. She translated his preferences into social law. If Richard thought something was beneath the family, Diane made sure everyone understood it was beneath the family, including me, including my sister Celeste, including every person who ever sat at their dining room table. I was the younger daughter. Celeste was the one who understood the game. She married a man named Preston who worked in finance and wore the right watches and laughed at the right moments. My parents loved Preston. They loved how he occupied a room. They loved that when Richard said something, Preston treated it like it had been handed down from a height. I was a civil engineer. I had been one since I finished my master's program at Oregon State, and I was good at it, specifically at infrastructure assessment, the part where someone hands you a structure and asks you to tell them what it can bear, what it can't, and what will happen if no one fixes what's already breaking. I had worked for a regional firm in Portland for 6 years. I made a comparable salary. I lived in a small house I had bought myself, in a neighborhood my mother described as transitional, by which she meant she didn't want to park there. My parents tolerated my career the way they tolerated a lot of things about me, with the particular brand of patience that is actually just deferred disappointment. They were waiting for me to pivot, to marry someone with a title, to move into a building with a doorman, to become, in some visible way, the version of their daughter that made more sense at their events. Andrew came into my life at a conference in Seattle. I was presenting a paper on load-bearing assessments for aging port infrastructure. He was sitting in the third row. He asked one question after my presentation, a technical question, specific, precise, and I remember thinking that whoever this man was, he had read the literature. He was 35. He ran a company called Meridian Infrastructure Partners. He had started it 7 years earlier with a partner, operating out of an office that was, by his own description, one room with 2 desks and a commercial-grade coffee maker that broke twice in the first month. By the time I met him, Meridian had grown considerably. He didn't lead with that. He didn't lead with much of anything, actually. He asked questions. He listened when I answered. He had a way of being quiet that felt like attention rather than absence. We dated for 14 months before he proposed. During those 14 months, I brought him to Portland twice for family dinners. Both times were instructive. The first dinner, my father asked Andrew what he did. Andrew said he ran an infrastructure investment firm in Seattle. My father asked the name. Andrew told him. My father didn't recognize it. He nodded in the way that signaled the topic was closed, and moved on to asking Celeste and Preston about their recent trip to Portugal. Andrew ate his dinner. He asked my mother about the architectural details of the house. She'd recently renovated the kitchen, and listened genuinely when she told him about the tile sourcing. My mother warmed slightly. My father remained somewhere between polite and indifferent. The second dinner was worse. Preston had just closed a deal he was proud of, a fund restructuring of some kind, significant by his standards, and the table was in celebration mode before the salad arrived. Celeste was glowing. My father was expansive. Preston held court in the way Preston always did, and Andrew sat across from him and said very little. I watched my father watching Andrew, and I could see the calculation happening in real time. Andrew did not perform. Andrew did not compete. And in my father's taxonomy, a man who did not compete was a man who did not have enough to compete with. After that dinner, driving back to the hotel, Andrew said only, "Your father is a man who needs to know the score." I said, "Yes." Andrew said, "He'll find out eventually." I didn't ask him to elaborate. The proposal happened on a Sunday morning in Seattle, at a farmer's market we'd been going to since our third date. Andrew had the ring in his jacket pocket. He's always putting things in his jacket pocket, and he proposed between the bread stall and the flower vendor, quietly, without staging or spectacle. I said yes before he finished the sentence. I called my parents that afternoon. My father said, "We'll need to meet him properly before anything is planned." My mother said, "Nora, are you certain? You've only known him a little over a year." I told them I was certain. The meeting they requested happened 3 weeks later. Andrew and I drove down to Portland together. It was a Saturday. My mother had set the table formally, which meant it was going to be a formal conversation. Celeste and Preston were there. I didn't know why until we sat down, and my father cleared his throat. He talked for a while about the family, about what the Callaway name meant in Portland, about the trajectory he had worked to build, and the kind of future he wanted for his daughters. He was not unkind exactly, but he was speaking in a register I recognized, the register he used when he had already made a decision, and was now explaining it to the person who would be affected by it. At one point, Preston leaned forward and said something about fit. That word, fit. As though Andrew were a part being assessed for compatibility with an existing mechanism. Andrew sat through all of it. He didn't fidget. He didn't defend himself. When my father finished, Andrew said, "I understand your concerns, Richard. I hope to address them over time." My father's jaw tightened slightly at being called Richard rather than Mr. Callaway, but he said nothing. We left after dessert. The letter arrived 11 days later. I know it took 11 days because Andrew told me he counted. Not obsessively, just the way he counts everything, the way he counts load tolerances and contract review windows and the number of days before a deal closes. 11 days after the dinner, the cream envelope arrived at our Seattle address. He read it while I was in the other room. He came to find me. He read me the key line. "You are not what this family built, and we are asking you, respectfully, to consider whether you are doing Nora any favors by staying." And then he folded the letter and put it in the inside pocket of his gray jacket. "I'm going to keep this," he said. "Why?" I asked. He thought about it for a moment. "Because I think it will be useful," he said, "to have a record of where we started." We got married 4 months later. Small ceremony. 43 people. None of them were Callaways. The person who did come, who drove up from Portland on her own, told no one she was coming, and sat in the second row with a packet of tissues she didn't end up needing because she held it together through sheer determination, was my great-aunt Margaret. Margaret was my grandmother's younger sister. She was 81 years old. She had been a labor attorney for 30 years, had argued cases in front of the state Supreme Court, had retired at 72, and then immediately taken up competitive bridge. She was, in her own words, allergic to nonsense. She had never trusted my father's version of what the family was. She told me this once, when I was 24 and visiting her in her apartment in Portland, a beautiful old building full of books and lamps and framed photos of people she had fought for in courtrooms. "Your father," she said, stirring her tea, "has confused success with worth. They are not the same measurement, and the confusion tends to cost people." She had given us a card at the wedding. Inside it, in her careful handwriting, she had written, "Nora, I know what I'm looking at. You chose well. Keep your receipts. Margaret." I kept the card in the same drawer where Andrew kept the letter. We didn't talk about it, but we both knew it was there. Margaret called me every 2 to 3 weeks. She didn't ask about my parents. She asked about my work. She asked about Andrew. She asked whether we were eating properly and whether Seattle's reputation for weather was deserved. She was the only member of my family who behaved as though our marriage was simply a fact of life, unremarkable and good. For the first year of our marriage, I operated on a kind of quiet suspension of belief. My parents didn't call. Celeste sent a Christmas card with a photo of her and Preston and their dog, no handwritten note inside. My father's assistant forwarded me the announcement when the Callaway firm was named in a regional business publication's annual list of top commercial developers. I don't know if that was intentional or an oversight. I didn't respond. Andrew and I built our life in Seattle. We bought a house in Eastlake, a 1940s craftsman that needed work, which Andrew approached the way he approached everything, methodically and without drama. He hired the right people. He asked the right questions. On weekends, he was there himself, learning what the house needed, understanding its load points, its weak spots, its potential. I thought sometimes that this was exactly the thing my father had missed, the patience that looks like passivity until you see what it's been building toward. My work had taken on a larger scope. I had been recruited by a firm called Langford Civil, one of the better infrastructure assessment companies in the Pacific Northwest. I was leading a team now, overseeing assessments on 3 port-adjacent structures in the region. It was demanding work. It was also, I realized slowly, work that intersected more and more with the projects Meridian was evaluating. Andrew and I had what we called a clean wall between our professional decisions. We did not share proprietary information. We did not discuss active deals. We recused ourselves formally when there was an overlap. But we understood each other's worlds. We spoke the same language about structures and risk and the long-time horizon of infrastructure. Meridian had grown. Andrew didn't broadcast this. He told me things, but he told them in the same way he told me about anything, factually without ornamentation. A new project in Tacoma. A partnership with the Port Authority on the east side of the Sound. A team expansion. The name Meridian was starting to appear in industry publications, in the specific publications where people in our field paid attention. My father, as far as I knew, did not read those publications. The break in the silence came from my mother, not my father. She called on a Thursday evening, 14 months after the wedding. I almost didn't pick up. I did pick up because Margaret had called earlier that week and mentioned, carefully, that she thought Diane was working up to something, and I trusted Margaret's intelligence on family weather patterns more than I trusted my own. My mother's voice was careful when she called. She asked how I was. She asked about the house. She said Seattle sounded cold. Then she said, "Your father and I have been talking. We think that perhaps things were handled badly. On both sides." I noticed the phrase "on both sides." I let it pass. She went on. There was an event coming up, a significant one. A development they had been working on for 3 years, a mixed-use commercial property on the east side of Portland, was finally going to break ground. There would be a groundbreaking dinner. Media. Partners. People who mattered to my father's world. She said, "We'd like you to come. Both of you." A pause. "It would mean a lot to your father, though he won't say it that way." I told her I would talk to Andrew. Andrew listened. He said, "I'll come if you want to go." I said, "I don't know if I want to go." He said, "Then we don't have to." I sat with it for 2 days. Margaret, when I called her, said, "Going is a choice. Not going is a choice. Neither one is the right answer. What matters is that you know why you're making it."
She paused.
I'd be curious to see how Richard handles it personally. But that's just an old woman's appetite for data. I called my mother back and said we would come. The groundbreaking dinner was on a Friday evening in late autumn. The venue was a converted warehouse space in the Pearl District, the kind of space that had been made beautiful through enormous expenditure and a skilled designer. Round tables, deep navy linens, architectural lighting. About 90 guests. The kind of room where everyone knew what everyone else's approximate net worth was, or thought they did. Andrew and I drove down from Seattle the day before and stayed at a hotel. We didn't stay with my parents. Andrew wore the gray jacket, I saw Celeste first. She was near the entrance with Preston, and she looked at Andrew the way she had always looked at him, with a careful neutrality that was itself a kind of judgment. She kissed my cheek. Preston shook Andrew's hand with a handshake that is slightly too firm in a way that is meant to establish something. Andrew shook back without comment. My father found us after the first round of drinks. He was in his element here, moving through the room like a man who had built it, which he essentially had.
He was warm in a public way.
He shook Andrew's hand. He said, "Good to see you both." He asked about Seattle. Andrew answered briefly and asked Richard about the project. My father expanded on the project, the timeline, the square footage, the partnerships involved, the expected return. He was explaining it at a level that assumed Andrew's interest was polite rather than substantive. Andrew nodded. He asked one question about the load-bearing specifications on the East Foundation, which was specific enough that my father paused and then said he'd have to ask the structural engineer. I watched something flicker across my father's face. Not recognition exactly. More like a recalibration that didn't quite complete. The dinner began. We were seated at a table near the middle, not the head tables, not the perimeter. A placement that was deliberate, I understood. We were invited, but we were positioned accordingly. At our table were 3 other couples, all connected to my father's development world in some way: contractors, a commercial lender, a city planning contact. They were cordial. The conversation was the conversation of people at professional dinners, the careful exchange of information about mutual projects, industry shifts, the state of the permitting process in the current political climate. Halfway through the main course, the man to my left, a contractor named Dennis who had worked with my father for 15 years, leaned over and said, with genuine curiosity, "And what is it you do, Andrew?" Andrew said, "Infrastructure investment. Primarily port adjacent." Dennis's head came forward slightly, the way people's heads move when something familiar has been named. He said, "In Seattle?" Andrew said, "Primarily, yes. We've expanded east over the last 2 years." Dennis said, "What's the firm?" Andrew said, "Meridian Infrastructure Partners." The change in Dennis's expression was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was the quiet closing of a gap. He said slowly, "Meridian? You're the Meridian that did the assessment partnership with the Port of Tacoma?" Andrew said yes. Dennis set his fork down. He said, "I was at the Port Authority review in September. Your team presented the Phase 2 findings. I didn't know." He looked across the table at my father, who was engaged in conversation on the other side. Dennis looked back at Andrew. He said, "Richard knows you work in infrastructure?" Andrew said, "He knows I run a firm." Dennis looked at his plate for a moment. Then he said, "Right." That word, the way he said it, just that one word, "right," landed in a way I felt in my sternum. I glanced at Andrew. He was cutting his food with complete attention, the way he always does. He looked up and caught my eye and gave me the small, steady look that I had learned meant, "We're fine." My father, across the room's social geometry, had not heard the exchange. But I noticed that Dennis was quiet for the rest of the dinner. And I noticed later, when the tables began to break into standing conversation, that Dennis found his way to 2 other people he knew and spoke to them briefly, and they both looked, just for a moment, just briefly, in Andrew's direction. The evening ended. My parents said polite goodbyes. My father told Andrew it was good to have him there. Andrew said he'd enjoyed meeting his colleagues. We drove back to the hotel. Andrew hung up the gray jacket. I asked him in the dark, "Do you think my father will look up Meridian?" Andrew was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He'll hear about it before he has a chance to look." I asked how he knew. He said, "Dennis knows people who know the commissioner. These things travel." I asked, "What commissioner?" He said, "You'll see. There's an event in the spring." I didn't push. I had learned, over the months of our marriage, that Andrew did not withhold to be mysterious. He withheld because he had a sense of timing, and he knew that the right moment was not always the current one. I lay in the dark and thought about the letter in his jacket pocket and what he had said about keeping records of where things started. The second rupture came from Celeste. She called me on a Wednesday in February, 3 months after the groundbreaking dinner. It was the longest conversation we had had in over a year. She started by asking about the house, about work, in a way that felt like she was building toward something.
She was.
After 10 minutes, she said, "I need to tell you something and I need you to not make it weird." I said I wouldn't. She said, "Mom and Dad have restructured the estate planning. Preston helped them with the advisors. It made sense financially, for tax purposes." A pause. "Your name isn't part of the current structure." I let that sit. She said, "It's not about you, Nora. It's about the business continuity. Preston has a fiduciary understanding of how these things work, and the structure they set up, it just doesn't accommodate." She stopped. Restarted. "It's a family decision. We talked about it with the advisors for months. It's not personal." I said, "You don't have to explain it as though it isn't what it is, Celeste." She said, "I just wanted you to hear it from me, not from Dad." I said, "I appreciate that." After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a while. The house was quiet. Outside, the February light over Lake Union was the flat silver that is Seattle's particular version of winter. I thought about what Celeste had said. It's a family decision. We talked about it. It's not personal. And I thought about all the ways families use procedural language to make structural choices feel like weather. As though they simply happen. As though no one decides them. I called Margaret. She picked up on the second ring. I told her what Celeste had said. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How do you feel?" I said, "Tired." She said, "That's a clean answer." Another pause. "I want you to know something, and I want you to file it in the right drawer in your head. Your grandmother, my sister, left certain things specifically and separately outside your father's estate structure. I was the executor. Those things are already yours. They have been for 6 years. Your father knows this and has chosen not to mention it because he prefers to believe his version of the inheritance is the one that matters." She said it the way she said everything, calmly, without performance. "I'm telling you now because it seems like a useful time for you to have the full picture." I said, "What kind of things?" She said, "Property. Some accounts. Nothing that will change your life dramatically, but enough that you are not as adrift as your father has been telling himself you are." I wrote down what she told me. I called my attorney the next day to confirm the documentation. It was all there, exactly as she said, in a file that had been properly recorded and had simply been waiting for me to look at it. I didn't tell Andrew about this part. Not because I was hiding it. I told him that evening, and he listened and said, "Margaret is a remarkable woman." Then he said, "You should call her more." I didn't tell anyone else. There was no reason to. The file existed. The record was clean. That was enough. The Seattle Port Authority Annual Infrastructure Gala happened every spring. It was a significant event in our industry, a gathering of port commissioners, infrastructure investors, engineering firms, city planners, and the federal and state officials who oversaw the regulatory environment for Pacific Northwest port development. The venue rotated, but it was always large and always formal. 300 guests, roughly. A program that included the presentation of the annual Infrastructure Investment Review, a summary of the preceding year's activity in the Puget Sound port system, presented by the commissioner and read into the public record. Meridian had been invited as a presenting partner for the past 2 years. This year, Andrew had been asked to speak, not a keynote, but a formal co-presentation with the Commissioner's Office about the Phase 3 assessment findings for a multi-port infrastructure corridor. It was the kind of invitation that signals a firm's position in an industry, the kind that is noted by everyone in the room. Andrew told me about the invitation in January. He mentioned it in the same way he mentioned most things, directly, without flourish. He said, "The Commissioner's Office wants us to co-present in April. The annual gala." I said, "Are you going to?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Should I come?" He looked at me for a moment in the way he sometimes does, the look that is actually a kind of question, and said, "I think you should, yes." Then he said, "I'd also like to invite your parents." I went very still. He said, "Not as a gesture, not as a statement. I want them in the room because I think it matters that they see this in context, in public, in a room full of people who understand what they're seeing." He paused. "Is that something you can do?" I thought about it for a long time that night. I thought about the letter. I thought about the groundbreaking dinner and Dennis's face. I thought about what Margaret had said, keep your receipts, and what Andrew had said the night of the letter. I think it will be useful to have a record of where we started. I called my mother the next morning. I told her that Andrew was co-presenting at the Port Authority Gala in Seattle in April, and that we would like them to attend as our guests if they were available. My mother was quiet for a moment. She said, "That sounds significant." I said, "It is." She said she would talk to my father. She called back that afternoon. She said they would come. The gala was on the second Friday of April. The venue was a converted maritime warehouse on the waterfront, original timber framing, enormous windows overlooking the Sound, the kind of space that was genuinely beautiful in a way that felt earned by the building itself. Round tables, white linens, the low sound of a string quartet in the early part of the evening. 314 guests, which I know because it was in the program. Andrew and I arrived early. He was in the gray suit he wore for formal presentations, not the jacket, the full suit, charcoal with a narrow lapel, and he had the gray jacket with him as well, folded over his arm when we walked in, then hung on the back of his chair at our table. He was calm in the way he was always calm before something important, not distant, just very present in a specific way, as though he had already run through everything that needed to be run through and could now simply be in the room. My parents arrived 40 minutes before the program began. I saw them at the entrance. My father was in his event posture, upright, scanning the room with the practiced assessment of a man who needs to know where he stands in any given geography. My mother was beside him, elegant, composed. They looked like what they were, people who belonged at this kind of event, people who were comfortable in formal rooms. That part was true. It had just never occurred to my father that there were formal rooms where Andrew was more significant than he was. I went to meet them at the entrance. We exchanged the greetings that had become our family's calibrated version of warmth, a kiss on the cheek, the how was the drive, the comment about the venue. My father shook Andrew's hand. He said, "Congratulations on the speaking role. That's significant." Andrew said, "It is. I'm glad you're here." We walked them to our table. We were at the front left of the room, close to the presentation area. I had not arranged this. It was where Meridian's table had been placed by the event organizers, because presenting partners sit at the front. I watched my father take in the table placement. He noted it. He said nothing. Around us, people came to speak to Andrew. Not in an aggressive way, not in a way that could be called conspicuous, but in the steady, natural way that happens when someone is known in a room. The commissioner's deputy stopped by to confirm the running order. 2 Port Authority board members came over to exchange brief words about the Phase 3 findings. A woman from the Army Corps of Engineers office said something to Andrew about the corridor assessment that made him nod and say he'd follow up on Monday. Each of these interactions was brief and professional and completely unremarkable to everyone except my father, who was sitting close enough to witness all of them and whose face I watched with the peripheral attention of someone who has spent a lifetime reading that face. He was recalculating. I could see it. It was not dramatic. My father was not a man given to visible drama. But there was something in the stillness of his posture that was different from his usual stillness, a quality of concentration that meant he was processing something he had not expected to be processing. My mother had found her conversational footing more quickly. She was talking to the woman to her right, a city planner named Greta, about the venue, about the building's history. She was comfortable. She did not notice, or chose not to notice, what I was noticing about my father. Celeste and Preston were not there. I had not asked Andrew whether to invite them. Andrew had not raised it. Some decisions are made by omission, and both people understand this without saying so. The program began at 7:30. The commissioner of the Port of Seattle, a compact, authoritative woman named Hartwell who had been in the role for 8 years, took the podium first. She spoke for 12 minutes about the year's infrastructure activity, the investments made, the assessments completed, the regulatory changes navigating through the federal pipeline. She was good at this, precise, specific, the opposite of vague. The room was attentive. Then she said, "The centerpiece of this year's review is the Phase 3 multi-port corridor assessment, the most comprehensive structural evaluation of the Puget Sound port system in 22 years. I want to recognize the firm that led the independent assessment and investment partnership that made this work possible. She looked toward our table. Meridian Infrastructure Partners, led by Andrew Voss, has been the backbone of this corridor evaluation. I'd like to ask Andrew to come up and walk us through the findings. Andrew stood. He buttoned his jacket, the suit jacket, and walked to the podium. I did not look at my father in this moment. I had decided, weeks earlier, that I would not look at my father in this moment. I looked at Andrew. He was good at this. He had always been good at this. The precise communication of complex information to a room that needed to trust the information. He spoke for 18 minutes. He put the corridor data on the screen, maps, load assessments, the phased investment findings, the structural recommendations. He cited numbers. Not abstract numbers, real ones. The specific load capacities of 3 different port structures. The projected maintenance costs across the 15-year corridor plan. The investment figures that Meridian had facilitated across the Phase 1 through Phase 3 assessments. And then Commissioner Hartwell returned to the podium for the formal record reading. This was the procedural part of the evening, the part where the investment activity was formally entered into the public record, as required by the Port Authority's charter. She read it the way a legal document is read, in a voice that was clear and unhurried. She read Meridian's portfolio involvement in the corridor work. She read the total value of the infrastructure assets under Meridian's advisory partnership in the Puget Sound region. The number was $290 million. The room absorbed this the way informed rooms absorb large numbers, with the quiet attentiveness of people who understand the scale and its implications. There was a ripple of acknowledgement, the kind that moves through a professional audience when something that was known becomes official. I looked at my father. He had gone pale. Not dramatically. Not the theatrical pallor of a man in a film. Just the specific, quiet draining that happens when the body registers a significant revision. He was sitting very straight. His hands, which had been resting on the tablecloth, had gone still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. His eyes were on the podium, but they were the eyes of a man looking inward, not outward. My mother put her hand over his briefly. Then she moved it back. Andrew returned to the table.
He sat down.
He poured himself a glass of water. He caught my eye and gave me the small, steady look. The evening's program continued. The string quartet resumed. Plates were cleared, and the dessert course came. Conversations restarted around us. My father said nothing for 7 minutes. I know because I counted the way Andrew counts things, which is a habit I have apparently absorbed. Then he said, to Andrew, in a voice that was very controlled, "The firm. How long has it been at this scale?" Andrew said, "The corridor partnership began about 4 years ago. The scale you saw tonight reflects the cumulative position." My father said, "And before that?" Andrew said, "We were smaller. 7 years ago, it was 2 of us and a coffee maker that kept breaking." He said it the same way he had said it to me, on our first date, factually without performance. My father looked at Andrew for a moment. He said, "I see." Those 2 words. He looked down at his dessert. He picked up his fork. He did not say anything else for the remainder of the meal. The cascade did not happen that night. It happened over the following weeks, in the quiet, documentary way that real reversals unfold, not with confrontation, but with a slow accumulation of evidence that changes the position a person occupies in the world. The morning after the gala, Dennis, the contractor for my father's groundbreaking dinner, who had been at the gala as well, who had said right in that particular way, sent Andrew a message requesting a meeting. They met for coffee 3 days later. I don't know everything that was said. Andrew told me the relevant part. Dennis had a project in the preliminary phase that he thought Meridian might want to look at. It was in the Portland market.
Portland.
Andrew said he would take a look. Within 2 weeks of the gala, 4 separate people from my father's professional world had made contact with Andrew through various channels, a city planning contact, a commercial lender, the partner of one of the board members who had been at our table. These were not dramatic outreaches. They were the ordinary professional contacts that flow toward firms that have been publicly recognized in the right settings. Andrew handled them the way he handled everything, systematically and without comment. My father's firm was not doing badly. but it was operating in a market that Meridian had begun to touch. Portland wasn't Meridian's primary geography, but it was adjacent, and the corridor work, now public, had given Meridian a regional profile that extended south of the Sound. My father was beginning to understand this in a way he hadn't been able to before. My mother called me on the Thursday after the gala. She said, "Your father hasn't said much, but I can see him thinking." She said it without effect, just as an observation. Then she said, "Nora, I think things were not handled as they should have been." I said, "No, they weren't." She said, "Your father is a proud man." I said, "I know that." She said, "He'd like to," she stopped. Restarted. "He'd like to have a real conversation with you. Both of you. About things." She did not specify which things.
She didn't need to.
I told her I would talk to Andrew. Andrew listened. He said, "If you want to see them, we'll see them." I said, "What do you want?"
He thought about it.
He said, "I want what you want. And I want it to be real, not provisional." I called my mother back and said we were open to a conversation. I said it would need to be an honest one. She said she understood. The dinner happened on a Saturday 3 weeks later at my parents' house in Portland. It was the four of us, no Celeste, no Preston. My mother had cooked, which was her version of sincerity. My father was in the living room when we arrived, and he stood when Andrew walked in. He extended his hand. He said, "Andrew."
Just the name.
Andrew shook his hand. The dinner was not a confrontation. It was something harder. A meal between people who were figuring out how to be in the same room with an honest accounting of what had happened between them. My father did not apologize directly. My father does not do things directly. But at one point in the evening, when the conversation had moved into a quieter register, he said, looking at the table rather than at Andrew, "I made a judgment without enough information. I can see that now." Andrew said, "I understand how it looked." My father looked up. He said, "You were more patient than I would have been." Andrew said, "I had reason to be patient." My father nodded. Just once.
It was not everything.
It was not a transformation. But it was the first conversation I had ever witnessed between them that was based on something real rather than something performed. After dinner, when we were saying goodbye in the entryway, my father put on his coat and then paused. He said to Andrew, "That firm of yours. The Portland market, if you're looking at it, there are things I know about the regulatory landscape here that might be useful." Andrew said, "I appreciate that. I'll take you up on it." It wasn't a resolution. It was something more modest and more real. Two people who had misjudged each other beginning the slow, effortful work of recalibration. I understood this was going to take time.
I was prepared for that.
What I was not prepared for was Celeste. She called me 6 days after the Portland dinner. She had heard about the gala from Preston, who had apparently heard about it from someone in the commercial lending world who had been there. She opened the conversation carefully, asking how things were going, how the dinner with my parents had been. Then she said, "Preston says Andrew's firm that the numbers are significant." I said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think we may have underestimated the situation." I said, "Yes." Another pause. "How is Andrew? Is he?" I said, "He's good, Celeste. He's always been good." She said, "Right." And she said it exactly the way Dennis had said it at the groundbreaking dinner, with that same quality of a gap closing. "I'd like to see you both sometime, if that's something you're open to." I said I would think about it. I told Andrew. He said, "Your call." I said, "I'm not sure what to do with Celeste." He said, "You don't have to do anything with Celeste right now. You can just let it be where it is." I let it be where it was. The night after the Portland dinner, lying in our bed in Seattle with the window cracked to let in the spring air off the lake, I asked Andrew about the letter. He was quiet for a moment. Then he got up. He went to the closet where the gray jacket hangs. He came back to bed with the letter in his hand, still folded along the original crease, still in reasonable condition after 15 months in an inside pocket. He handed it to me. I held it. I didn't unfold it. I already knew what it said. After a while, I asked, "What do you want to do with it?"
He thought about it.
He said, "I think it's done its work." I said, "Where should it go?" He said, "Wherever you want to put it." I put it in the drawer where Margaret's card already lives, next to each other, the letter and the card. "You are not what this family built." And next to it, "You chose well. Keep your receipts." I thought about what it means to build something. My father had spent 30 years building a version of the world in which value was visible and volume was proof. Andrew had spent 7 years building something that didn't announce itself until the moment the public record required it to. I had spent those same years building assessments of structures, figuring out what they could hold, what they couldn't, where the load points were. The three of us had been building different things and judging each other by different blueprints. That doesn't make the judgment right, but it explains some of it. What I know now, and what I should have been able to say sooner, though I'm not sure I had the words, is that the people who need you to fail in order to feel safe in their own position will always find a reason to dismiss what you are building. And the people who are actually building something rarely need you to notice it at all. They are too busy with the work. Andrew kept the letter for 15 months because he understood something I was still learning, that the record matters, not as a weapon but as a document. A record of where you started. A record of what was said and when and by whom. And a record of what, quietly and without announcement, was built anyway. That is my story. A letter in a jacket pocket, a ballroom in Seattle, and $290 million that had always been there, waiting patiently for the right room. If someone has ever written you off, put you in an envelope and sealed it shut, I want to ask you something. What did you build while they weren't watching? Not what you wished you'd built. What you actually quietly built. Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.